Before we begin, we want to acknowledge the families whose babies died or were harmed in the care of the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital. The loss of a child is an unimaginable pain, and nothing discussed in this episode is intended to diminish that loss, reopen wounds, or question the love and grief carried by those families. Our thoughts remain with them, and with the children whose lives are at the centre of this case. This episode addresses an exceptionally sensitive and complex subject. It follows a criminal trial in which Lucy Letby was convicted of murder and attempted murder, and where those convictions remain legally binding. The legal reality is not in dispute, and this episode does not seek to retry the case, challenge the jury, or override the authority of the courts. However, for some cases, a verdict does not bring public conversation to an end. In the months and years following the trial, a growing number of medical professionals, academics, campaigners, and commentators have raised concerns about how the evidence was interpreted, how alternative explanations were handled, and whether systemic failures within neonatal care were fully accounted for. These concerns have been expressed through professional reports, parliamentary debate, public inquiry, and documentary investigation. This episode examines the case made by those who believe Lucy Letby may have been wrongly convicted, and explores why some argue this could represent a miscarriage of justice. It does so carefully, responsibly, and with clear distinction between established legal findings and post-conviction challenges raised by others. What follows is not a declaration of innocence, nor a denial of tragedy. It is an examination of doubt, where it comes from, who's raising it, and why it continues to persist in one of the most disturbing cases in modern British history. In the months following the convictions, a parallel conversation began to take shape beyond the courtroom. It did not emerge overnight, nor did it come from a single source. Instead, it developed gradually, as individuals with professional backgrounds in medicine, academia, and public service began to voice concerns about the case and the evidence that underpinned it. Public campaigns calling for a review of the convictions have since appeared, some led by clinicians and researchers, others supported by members of the public who believed the trial left critical questions unanswered. These campaigns have taken the form of open letters, petitions, public meetings, and peaceful protests. While they differ in tone and approach, they share a common position, that the case deserves closer scrutiny, particularly given its reliance on complex medical interpretation. Since Lucy Letby's conviction, there has been a visible and growing public response from people who believe she has been wrongly convicted. Campaigns calling for her release have emerged both online and offline, with supporters organising petitions, protests, and awareness campaigns under banners calling for a full review of the case. These efforts have attracted attention not only from members of the public, but also from professionals who argue that the medical and digital evidence deserves closer scrutiny. Much of this public mobilization has been driven by claims that aspects of the prosecution case, including interpretations of swipe card data and staff movement, may have been misunderstood or overstated. As reported in national media, supporters argue that such data does not reliably establish presence at the bedside at critical moments and should not be treated as definitive proof of opportunity or intent. While these claims remain disputed and have not altered the legal standing of the convictions, they have contributed to a broader sense among campaigners that the case warrants independent re-examination. It is important to stress that public support, however widespread or passionately expressed, does not determine guilt or innocence. Courts do not decide cases by petition or protest, but the scale and persistence of these campaigns are significant in their own right, reflecting a level of public unease that has not subsided with the passage of time. For critics of the convictions, this sustained attention is seen not as a denial of tragedy, but as an appeal for transparency, accountability, and confidence that justice has been done correctly. Alongside public campaigning, professional dissent has become increasingly visible. Senior neonatologists, pediatric specialists, and researchers have spoken publicly about their discomfort with aspects of the prosecution case. Some have stated that, in their opinion, the medical evidence presented at trial does not conclusively demonstrate deliberate harm. Others have questioned whether alternative explanations were given sufficient weight, or whether retrospective interpretation played too great a role in shaping conclusions. This dissent has not been limited to one country or institution. An international panel of neonatal experts has since published detailed critiques of the clinical evidence relied upon in multiple baby cases. Their work has been circulated widely among medical professionals and has become a central reference point for those arguing that the convictions may represent a miscarriage of justice. These experts do not speak with judicial authority, but their qualifications and experience have given their views significant influence within professional circles. Political attention has also followed. Questions have also been raised in Parliament about whether the justice system is adequately equipped to handle cases that depend so heavily on contested scientific opinion. These interventions have not called for verdicts to be overturned by decree, but for proper mechanisms of review to be allowed to function without obstruction or stigma. It is important to be clear about what this chapter represents. The existence of campaigns and dissent does not establish innocence, nor does it invalidate the jury's verdict, but it does demonstrate that the case has not settled into quiet acceptance. Instead, it has become a focal point for wider concerns about how criminal justice intersects with highly specialized medicine. For the families affected, this renewed attention can be painful. Each resurgence of debate risks reopening a chapter they may wish had finally closed. That reality must be held alongside the principle that justice systems are strongest when they are willing to tolerate scrutiny, especially in cases where the consequences are irreversible. To understand why these campaigns and challenges exist, we must look closely at the professional critiques that underpin them, beginning with the work of the international expert panel itself. In the years following Lucy Letby's conviction, a group of international neonatal specialists came together to independently review aspects of the medical evidence presented at trial. This group, often referred to as an international expert panel, includes senior neonatologists, pediatric specialists, and academics with decades of experience in neonatal intensive care. Among the most prominent figures associated with this effort is Dr. Shu Lee, a retired Canadian neonatologist widely published in the field of neonatal medicine. Dr. Shu Lee is a retired Canadian neonatologist and clinical researcher with a career spanning more than 4 decades in neonatal intensive care and academic medicine. He is a former professor of pediatrics at the University of Toronto and has held senior clinical roles at major neonatal centres in Canada. Dr. Lee has authored over 200 peer-reviewed scientific publications, many of them focused on neonatal outcomes, intensive care practices, and the interpretation of clinical data in premature infants. He has also served on international advisory panels, contributed to guideline development, and acted as a reviewer for leading medical journals. Within neonatology, he is regarded as a highly experienced clinician academic, particularly known for his work in neonatal morbidity, mortality analysis, and the limits of retrospective interpretation of complex clinical events. For viewers who wish to hear Dr. Shu Lee explain his conclusions in his own words, a link to a full video discussion is included in the description of this episode. It is important to be clear from the outset about what the panel is, and what it is not. The panel does not have judiciary authority. Its members were not tasked with determining guilt or innocence, nor with rerunning the criminal trial. Their work does not overturn verdicts, and it does not substitute for the decisions of a jury. What it represents instead is a post-conviction professional review of medical interpretations, undertaken by clinicians who argue that key conclusions presented to the jury were medically unsound or incomplete. The panel reviewed clinical summaries of the babies for whom Lucy Letby was convicted, relying on medical records, trial exhibits, expert testimony as reported in court, and post-mortem findings where available. Their focus was narrow but deliberate. They examined whether the medical mechanisms alleged at trial, including air embolism, insulin poisoning, deliberate overfeeding, airway interference, and tube dislodgement, were, in their professional opinion, supported by neonatal physiology and clinical evidence. Crucially, the panel's work does not claim certainty. Again and again, their conclusions are framed in terms of plausibility, probability, and differential diagnosis, concepts central to clinical medicine, but often uncomfortable in criminal courtrooms. They argue not that they can prove an alternative narrative beyond doubt, but that multiple medically credible explanations were available and, in their view, not adequately explored or presented to the jury. Across their analyses, a recurring theme emerges: that many of the babies involved were extremely premature, clinically ill, growth restricted, or suffering from complex conditions that place them at high risk of sudden deterioration, even with appropriate care. The panel repeatedly highlights factors such as sepsis, thrombosis, pneumothorax, necrotizing enterocolitis, delivery-related trauma, delayed escalation, and suboptimal resuscitation as explanations that, in their view, fit the clinical timelines without invoking deliberate harm. The panel also raises concerns about retrospective interpretation. They argue that patterns identified after the fact, particularly when filtered through the lens of criminal suspicion, can appear more coherent and intentional than they would have seemed in real time on a busy neonatal unit. From a clinical standpoint, they caution that clustering of adverse outcomes does not automatically imply causation, particularly in a unit caring for some of the most vulnerable patients in medicine. Supporters of the convictions have strongly rejected the panel's conclusions, arguing that they rely on selective interpretation, hindsight bias of their own, and incomplete access to all trial material. They also emphasize that the jury heard from prosecution and defense experts at the time, and those proceedings were tested through cross-examination. That tension between judicial finality and ongoing professional disagreement lies at the heart of why this case continues to be debated. The panel's findings do not rewrite the verdict, but they do challenge a central assumption: that the medical evidence presented at trial was settled, unequivocal, and beyond reasonable dispute. And it is that challenge, grounded not in advocacy, but in clinical dissent, that forms the foundation for the chapters that follow. Having set out who the international expert panel are, and the limits of their role, the next step is to examine what they actually say when they turn to the individual baby cases. This is where the panel's work becomes most detailed and most controversial. Across multiple cases, the panel argues that the collapses and deaths attributed to deliberate harm can be explained by well-recognized neonatal conditions, many of which were either present, developing, or insufficiently managed at the time. Their contention is not that something extraordinary did not happen, but that what happened may not have been extraordinary in the context of extremely vulnerable premature infants. One of the most frequent alternative explanations raised is sepsis. The panel repeatedly points to babies who showed clinical deterioration hours, sometimes days, before collapse, including temperature instability, rising inflammatory markers, feeding intolerance, abdominal distension, metabolic acidosis, and recurrent apnea. In neonatal medicine, sepsis is rarely sudden. It evolves, often subtly, before overwhelming a fragile infant. The panel argues that in several cases, the pattern of decline fits infection far more closely than a sudden act of sabotage. Another recurring explanation is thrombosis, particularly in babies with central or long intravenous lines. The panel highlights that thrombotic events are common in premature infants, especially when lines are left idle, kinked, or inadequately anticoagulated. In some cases, they point to maternal conditions that significantly increase clotting risk. From their perspective, sudden collapse following the restarting of an infusion is more consistent with thromboembolism than with air injection. Respiratory complications feature heavily in the panel's analysis. Several babies developed pneumothoracis, trapped air in the chest that can rapidly become fatal if not recognized and treated promptly. The panel described repeated delays in diagnosis, delayed needle decompression, poorly positioned chest drains, and escalation to high-pressure ventilation that may have worsened rather than relieved the problem. In their view, these episodes represent mismanaged respiratory emergencies rather than deliberate interference with airways or tubes. The panel also revisits cases involving gastrointestinal symptoms, including abdominal distension, vomiting, and bloody gastric contents. Rather than attributing these signs to injected air or overfeeding, they point to conditions such as necrotizing enterocolitis, ileus caused by infection, congenital bowel abnormalities, or in utero hypoxic injury to the gut. In several cases, they argue that clear red flags for urgent surgical review were present but not acted upon. We'll give the definition for a lot of the terminology in the description below. A lot of the terminology used is not common, however, is frequently used by the expert panel. Where resuscitation occurred, the panel is particularly critical of what they describe as suboptimal or chaotic responses. They document prolonged periods of ineffective ventilation, multiple failed intubation attempts, delayed securing of airways, and early administration of adrenaline before oxygenation was established. In neonatal care, they note, ineffective resuscitation itself can determine outcome, regardless of the original trigger. Importantly, the panel does not claim that care was malicious. Their argument is that neonatal intensive care is complex, fast-moving, and highly dependent on early recognition and escalation. When systems are stretched, staff are inexperienced, or escalation pathways fail, outcomes can deteriorate rapidly. In that environment, they argue, it is possible for multiple adverse events to occur without a single intentional cause. Supporters of the verdict argue that these explanations were considered and rejected at trial. Critics respond that while individual alternatives may have been mentioned, they were never fully developed as competing narratives, particularly when viewed collectively across cases. What emerges from the panel's re-examination is not a single alternative theory, but a mosaic of medically plausible explanations, each grounded in known neonatal pathology, each capable of producing sudden and devastating collapse. Whether those explanations should have altered the jury's conclusions is not something the panel can decide, but they argue forcefully that the medicine itself is far less settled than the verdict might suggest. This chapter does not claim to replace one certainty with another. It illustrates instead how, in complex medical cases, the same facts can lead to profoundly different conclusions depending on the lens through which they are viewed. And it is precisely that uncertainty, medical, not moral, that drives continuing debate. At the core of the prosecution case against Lucy Letby were specific medical mechanisms said to demonstrate deliberate harm. Air embolism, insulin poisoning, and the introduction of air through nasogastric tubes. These mechanisms were presented to the jury as explanations for sudden collapses that could not otherwise be accounted for. It is precisely these mechanisms that the international expert panel, along with other neonatal specialists, now challenge most strongly. Beginning with air embolism, the panel argues that the physical signs relied upon at trial, particularly patchy skin discoloration, are not diagnostic of air entering the bloodstream. In neonatal medicine, mottling and colour changes are common responses to hypoxia, shock, sepsis, and circulatory instability. The panel cites published research indicating that venous air embolism in infants does not produce the distinctive skin patterns described in court, and that such signs have been repeatedly misinterpreted outside a broader clinical context. They also question the plausibility of undetected air injection in a busy neonatal unit. For air embolism to occur in the way alleged, air would need to be introduced in sufficient volume, followed by rapid reinfusions of fluids to avoid detection, or without immediate clinical response from surrounding staff. The panel argues that this sequence is not consistent with how neonatal units function in practice, particularly during emergencies. The second major pillar under scrutiny is insulin poisoning. At trial, abnormal insulin and C-peptide ratios were presented as evidence of external insulin administration. The panel challenges this interpretation on several grounds. Premature infants, especially those who are septic or growth-restricted, have immature endocrine symptoms that do not conform to adult biochemical norms. Insulin and C-peptide levels fluctuate widely, assays are prone to interference, and autoimmune antibodies, common in preterm infants, can artificially elevate measured insulin levels. The panel also highlights that glucose instability in these babies often corresponded directly with changes in dextrose concentration, line infiltration, or delayed escalation of glucose delivery. In their view, this pattern is consistent with undertreatment of hypoglycemia rather than poisoning. It is in this context that comparisons are sometimes made with the case of Beverly Allitt, the only widely accepted UK case involving deliberate insulin administration to infants. That case is frequently cited not as a parallel of guilt, but as a benchmark for evidential clarity. In the Allitt case, insulin administration was reportedly documented. Hypoglycemic episodes were consistent and reproducible, and there were no competing physiological explanations. Critics of the Lucy Letby convictions argue that, by contrast, the insulin evidence here is disputed, retrospective, and inseparable from the baby's extreme prematurity and illness. The third mechanism under challenge involves air introduced via nasogastric tubes. The panel argues that large volumes of air found in the stomach or intestines are far more plausibly explained by bag and mask ventilation, CPAP, or neopuff use during resuscitation. These interventions are known to force air into the gastrointestinal tract, particularly in distressed infants. If air had been deliberately introduced in the volumes alleged, the panel contends that the resulting abdominal distension would have been profound, persistent, and clearly documented, which, in many cases, it was not. Across all three mechanisms, a common critique emerges: that signs commonly seen in critically ill neonates were interpreted as intentional acts rather than as manifestations of disease, resuscitation, or delayed intervention. The panel does not deny that the babies collapsed. What they dispute is whether the biological evidence uniquely points to human intent. Supporters of the verdict maintain that these mechanisms were thoroughly examined at trial and accepted by the jury. Critics respond that the jury was asked to interpret highly specialized medical evidence in the absence of consensus within the medical community itself, and that where medicine is uncertain, criminal certainty becomes far harder to justify. This chapter does not resolve that conflict, but it underscores why these specific medical claims remain the most contested aspects of this case, and why they continue to drive calls for deeper review. Beyond individual medical mechanisms, critics of the convictions argue that the events at the Countess of Chester Hospital cannot be understood without examining the wider system in which they occurred. Rather than asking whether one person caused multiple collapses, they ask a different question: whether a struggling neonatal unit, operating beyond its limits, could plausibly produce repeated catastrophic outcomes without deliberate harm. At the time of the events, the neonatal unit was part of a district general hospital, not a specialist centre. It was caring for extremely premature and medically complex babies, some of whom, critics argue, should have been transferred earlier to higher-level facilities. The expert panel repeatedly points to delays in escalation, delayed transfers, and hesitation in seeking external specialist input as recurring features across cases. Staffing level and experience also feature prominently in this analysis. Several cases involved junior doctors or inexperienced nurses responding to rapidly evolving emergencies. Critics note prolonged periods of ineffective resuscitation, multiple failed intubation attempts, delayed securing of airways, and reliance on escalating drug interventions before basic ventilation and circulation were adequately stabilized. In neonatal care, seconds and minutes matter, and systemic weaknesses can have fatal consequences. Respiratory emergencies form one of the clearest examples of this argument. In multiple cases, pneumothoraces were either missed, diagnosed late, or inadequately treated. Needle decompression was delayed, chest drains were poorly positioned, and infants were ventilated with high pressures that may have worsened circulatory collapse. These are recognized risks in neonatal medicine, and when compounded by delayed decision-making, they can quickly overwhelm even a previously stable infant. The panel and other commentators also highlight failures in recognizing evolving infection. Sepsis does not always announce itself dramatically. It can present as a feeding intolerance, temperature instability, metabolic acidosis, or subtle respiratory changes long before collapse. Critics argue that in several cases, these warning signs were present but not acted upon decisively, allowing deterioration to continue unchecked. Another recurring theme is the management of intravenous lines and infusions. Central and long lines carry known risks, including thrombosis, infection, and infiltration. The panel points to periods where lines were left without infusion, kinked, or inadequately monitored, all of which increase the risk of clot formation and embolic events. In such circumstances, sudden collapse does not require malicious action to occur. Those advancing this systemic framework argue that once suspicion is focused on a single individual, these broader failures receded into the background. Patterns that might otherwise have prompted a service-level review were instead interpreted through the lens of criminality. In their view, the question shifted from "what went wrong here?" to "who did this?", narrowing the scope of inquiry. Supporters of the convictions rejected this framing, pointing out that systemic pressures exist across the National Health Service, yet do not routinely produce clusters of deaths linked to one staff member. Critics respond that this assumes systems fail uniformly, when in reality, failures can concentrate where staffing, training, escalation culture, and patient acuity intersect. This chapter does not deny that the outcomes were devastating, nor does it excuse poor care if it occurred. Instead, it highlights an alternative framework increasingly raised by medical professionals, that multiple tragedies can arise not from a single hidden hand, but from layered vulnerabilities within a system under strain. Understanding that possibility is essential before conclusions about intent can be treated as settled beyond doubt. Within the wider debate, certain baby cases have become focal points for those arguing that the convictions may represent a miscarriage of justice. These cases are repeatedly cited in professional discussions, not because they are more tragic than others, but because critics believe they most clearly expose gaps between medical reality and the conclusions reached at trial. One such case involves a baby whose collapse followed a prolonged period of clinical deterioration rather than a sudden, unexplained event. Speakers on the panel point to hours of warning signs, including rising heart rate, metabolic acidosis, abdominal distension, and feeding intolerance that are consistent with infection or evolving bowel pathology. In this context, critics argue that focusing on a single dramatic moment obscures a broader trajectory of decline that fits known neonatal disease processes. Another case highlighted involves severe respiratory compromise, complicated by a pneumothorax. The panel draws attention to delayed diagnosis, delayed drainage, and repeated escalation to high-pressure ventilation. According to the speakers, these factors alone are sufficient to explain repeated desaturations and collapse. They argue that attributing these events to airway interference overlooks the documented mechanical failures and clinical delays visible in the records. Several cases involving gastrointestinal symptoms are also discussed in detail. The video emphasizes that vomiting, abdominal distension, and large volumes of air aspirated from nasogastric tubes are common during resuscitation and respiratory support. Critics note that bag and mask ventilation, CPOP, and neopuff use routinely force air into the stomach and intestines. When these interventions precede imaging or examination, they argue, it becomes misleading to treat gastrointestinal air as evidence of deliberate introduction. The panel also highlights cases involving hyperglycemia, where insulin poisoning was alleged. Speakers point to glucose trends that rose predictably when dextrose concentration was increased, and fell when infusion was inadequate or interrupted. They argue that this pattern supports undertreatment rather than exogenous insulin administration. Particular concern is raised about applying adult biochemical standards to premature infants whose metabolic responses differ profoundly. In several cases, critics emphasize that similar episodes of deterioration occurred after transfer to other hospitals, where Lucy Letby had no involvement. These subsequent events are cited as evidence that the underlying conditions were ongoing and not isolated to a particular environment or caregiver. For those questioning the convictions, this continuity weakens the argument that deliberate interference was the only plausible cause. Across the video discussion, a consistent theme emerges: that individual cases, when examined in isolation, may appear suspicious, but when viewed longitudinally, including events before and after periods of alleged harm, they align with recognized neonatal complications. The speakers argue that it is the broader temporal context that was insufficiently explored during the trial. Supporters of the verdict maintain that the jury was entitled to draw inferences from patterns across cases. Critics respond that pattern recognition is vulnerable to confirmation bias when alternative explanations are not given equal weight. In their view, once a narrative of intentional harm takes hold, clinical ambiguities are more easily interpreted as evidence rather than uncertainty. This chapter does not attempt to relitigate individual verdicts. Instead, it illustrates why certain cases continue to trouble medical professionals and legal observers alike, not because they deny tragedy, but because they believe the medicine itself does not point as clearly in one direction as the verdict suggests. As medical debate intensified after the trial, attention began to shift from clinical evidence to the investigative process itself. Critics of the convictions do not argue that the police acted with malice, but they do question whether the investigation became progressively narrowed around a single suspect in a way that limited alternative explanations. The investigation was led by Cheshire Police, initially responding to concerns raised by hospital management about an unusual number of baby deaths and collapses. At the outset, the focus was broad, reviewing mortality data, staffing rotas, medical records, and clinical outcomes. Over time, however, critics argued that this broad inquiry tightened into a hypothesis-driven investigation centered on Lucy Letby. Those raising concerns point to a common risk in complex cases: confirmation bias. Once investigators form a working theory, subsequent events can be unconsciously filtered through that lens. Actions or events that fit the theory are emphasized, while those that complicate it are given less weight. Critics argue that this risk is especially acute in cases involving highly technical medical evidence that investigators themselves are not clinically trained to interpret. One of the most frequently cited concerns is the interpretation of staff rotas. The presence of Lucy Letby during multiple collapses became a central plank of the case against her. Critics do not dispute that she was present, but they argue that presence alone is not proof of causation, particularly in a unit where staffing patterns, shift lengths, and continuity of care naturally place certain nurses at bedsides more often than others. They questioned whether alternative explanations for this correlation were sufficiently explored. Concerns have also been raised about how expert medical opinion was sought and weighed during the investigation. Critics argue that once a criminal narrative began to form, medical uncertainty was increasingly framed as evidence of wrongdoing rather than ambiguity. In their view, differential diagnoses were not pursued with equal vigour once suspicion focused on a single individual. Some commentators have drawn attention to internal dissent raised during the investigative period, including questions about whether deaths might reflect service-level problems rather than criminal acts. These concerns, critics say, were ultimately overtaken by the momentum of a criminal inquiry, making it difficult for alternative frameworks to regain traction. Supporters of the investigation respond that police were responding to unprecedented circumstances and acted on expert advice available at the time. They emphasized that decisions were subject to oversight, judicial scrutiny, and adversarial testing in court. Critics counter that the adversarial system itself can struggle with medical complexity. Once a case reaches trial, the narrative has often already crystallized. Evidence is presented not to explore uncertainty, but to persuade. In such an environment, early investigative assumptions can have long-lasting influence. This chapter does not assert that the investigation was flawed beyond repair. Rather, it explains why some observers now argue that investigative focus may have narrowed too early, and why they believe that matters when assessing whether all reasonable alternatives were fully examined before conclusions were reached. The question raised is not whether the police intended to secure a conviction at all costs, but whether the structure of the investigation made it harder to step back once a dominant theory took hold. As professional disagreement continued to surface beyond the courtroom, media scrutiny of the case intensified. One of the most prominent moments in the shift came with a documentary broadcast by Channel 4, which brought post-trial medical and investigative concerns into the public arena. The documentary did not claim to overturn verdicts, nor did it present itself as an alternative trial. Instead, it provided a platform for clinicians, commentators, and former professionals to articulate doubts that had largely remained confined to specialist or academic settings. For many viewers, it marked the first time they encountered the idea that respected medical figures questioned whether the evidence presented at trial was as conclusive as it appeared. Central to the programme was the theme of medical uncertainty. Contributors spoke about the limits of neonatal diagnostics, the risks of retrospective interpretation, and the dangers of translating complex clinical events into criminal intent. Importantly, the documentary acknowledged that the convictions remain legally binding, and it avoided making definitive claims about innocence. Its focus was on whether doubt existed, and whether that doubt had been sufficiently aired. The programme also touched on concerns about systemic pressures within neonatal care, and the possibility that institutional failings could be mistaken for individual wrongdoing. These arguments mirrored those raised by the International Expert Panel, and echoed themes from professional submissions to public inquiries. However, critics of the documentary have cautioned against overstating its significance. They argue that television programs, by their nature, simplify complex material and can give disproportionate weight to dissenting voices. They emphasize that editorial balance does not equate to evidential balance, and that courts, not broadcasters, determine guilt. Supporters respond that the documentary's value lies not in adjudication, but in transparency. By bringing expert disagreement into public view, they argue, it allows informed scrutiny of how medical evidence is used in criminal trials, particularly when the consequences are irreversible. What is clear is that the documentary did not create doubt where none existed. Rather, it amplified questions already being asked within professional circles, forcing a broader conversation about how certainty is constructed in cases involving rare, complex medical events. Following conviction, Lucy Letby pursued the only formal legal route available to challenge the jury's findings: appeal. Those appeals were considered by the Court of Appeal, which ultimately refused permission for the convictions to be overturned. For many observers, that refusal appeared to close the case. In legal terms, the convictions remain final. But critics argue that understanding why appeals fail is essential to understanding why debate continues. Appeal courts do not retry cases. They do not reassess guilt or innocence, hear new witnesses, or weigh competing medical interpretations afresh. Their role is limited to determining whether the original trial was conducted lawfully and fairly, whether the judge erred in directions to the jury, whether evidence was improperly admitted or excluded, or whether the verdicts were legally unsafe based on the material presented at trial. Critics of the convictions argue that this legal threshold creates a fundamental disconnect in medically complex cases. Even if significant professional disagreement emerges after a verdict, that disagreement alone does not meet the test required for an appeal. Scientific uncertainty, evolving research, or alternative expert opinion is not enough unless it can be shown that the jury was misled or that the trial process itself was flawed. In this case, the appeal court concluded that the jury had been entitled to assess the evidence it heard, and that the trial judge had properly directed them on how to do so. From a legal standpoint, that finding resolves the matter. From a medical standpoint, critics argue it does not. They point out that much of the dissent is now being raised, including critiques of air embolism markers, insulin interpretation in premature infants, and the role of systemic care failures, given prominence after the trial concluded. As a result, these arguments were never tested in front of a jury, not because they lacked merit, but because they were not yet fully articulated or supported by published research. This creates a difficult reality. A case can be legally closed while remaining scientifically contested. The justice system prioritizes finality, while medicine remains provisional, constantly refining its understanding as evidence evolves. Supporters of the verdict respond that allowing convictions to remain perpetually open to challenge would undermine the stability of the legal system. Critics counter that in cases invoking irreversible sentences, particularly those resting on contested medical interpretation, finality should not come at the expense of accuracy. Once conventional appeal routes are exhausted, there is only one formal pathway left within the English legal system for a conviction to be reconsidered: the Criminal Cases Review Commission, commonly known as the CCRC. The CCRC is an independent statutory body tasked with investigating potential miscarriages of justice. It does not decide guilt or innocence, and it does not act as a court. Its role is to assess whether there is a real possibility that a conviction would not be upheld if referred back to the Court of Appeal, based on new evidence, fresh expert analysis, or developments that were not available at trial. The threshold is deliberately high. Most applications are rejected. The CCRC does not intervene simply because a case is controversial or because professional disagreement exists. Something materially new must be identified: evidence or analysis that could realistically affect the safety of the conviction. Following the failure of Lucy Letby's appeals, attention has turned to this final mechanism. While Ben Myers Casey represented Lucy Letby at trial during her appeal, it is Mark MacDonald who has since been publicly associated with preparing material for potential submission to the CCRC. As discussed in the Channel 4 Lucy Letby documentary, this work focuses on developments that have emerged after the trial concluded. These include international expert critiques of air embolism evidence, challenges to the interpretation of insulin and C-peptide ratios in premature infants, and broader arguments that systemic failures within neonatal care were not fully accounted for during the criminal proceedings. The documentary does not suggest that a CCRC referral has been accepted, nor does it claim that the Commission has reached any conclusions. Instead, It outlines why campaigners, clinicians, and legal commentators believe the case might now meet the criteria for further independent review. Importantly, even if the CCRC were to make a referral, that would not overturn the convictions. It would simply return the case to the Court of Appeal, where judges would decide whether the new material renders the verdict unsafe. Many cases referred by the CCRC still fail at that stage. For critics of the convictions, the CCRC represents a narrow but significant opportunity, one of the few remaining routes through which unresolved medical and systemic questions could be examined outside the confines of the original trial. For supporters of the verdict, it is evidence that safeguards already exist, and that until they are triggered, the convictions must stand. At this point, the question that has hovered over every chapter becomes unavoidable. Is it possible that this case represents a miscarriage of justice? Those who raise that question do not do so lightly. They acknowledge the gravity of the crimes Lucy Letby was convicted of, the suffering of the families, and the seriousness with which the justice system approached the case. They also accept a central uncomfortable fact. The convictions are lawful, upheld, and binding. Yet miscarriage of justice arguments rarely begin with certainty. They begin with unease. In this case, that unease stems from several overlapping concerns. First, the existence of sustained professional disagreement about the medical evidence, not from the fringe voices, but from experienced neonatologists and clinicians who argue that the mechanisms alleged at trial are not medically diagnostic. Second, the presence of alternative explanations that, critics argue, were plausible, consistent with neonatal pathology, and insufficiently explored in combination. Third, there is concern about narrative momentum. Once suspicion amalgamated around a single nurse, critics argue that clinical ambiguity was increasingly interpreted as confirmation rather than uncertainty. Patterns became proof, presence became causation, and rare outcomes were treated as inherently sinister rather than statistically possible in a high-risk unit. Supporters of the verdict respond that juries are routinely asked to evaluate complex expert evidence, and that disagreement among professionals does not invalidate a lawful conviction. They emphasize that defense teams had the opportunity to challenge the prosecution case at trial, and that the jury reached its conclusion after months of evidence and deliberation. Critics counter that criminal trials are not well suited to resolving deep scientific uncertainty. They argue that when medicine is unsettled, the adversarial process may force clarity where none truly exists, rewarding confidence over caution, and narrative coherence over complexity. This tension lies at the heart of debate. It is possible, critics argue, for a case to be both legally sound and factually fragile. It is possible for a jury to act conscientiously and still reach conclusions that later evidence calls into question. And it is possible for acknowledging doubt to coexist with respect for the families who lost children. Importantly, those raising miscarriage of justice concerns do not all agree on the same alternative explanation. Some emphasize systemic failure, others focus on specific medical interpretations, and others highlight investigative narrowing. What unites them is not certainty of innocence, but concern that clarity of guilt may have been reached too quickly in a medically complex environment. Before closing, it is essential to return to the people most affected by this case. Behind every clinical record, behind every court exhibit, and every debate about evidence are parents and families who lost babies, or who watched their children suffer in circumstances no family should ever endure. Their grief is real, permanent, and deserving of respect. Nothing in this episode is intended to diminish their pain, question their loss, or turn tragedy into abstraction. Our thoughts remain with them. This episode has explored why doubts persist about the convictions in this case, not as an act of defiance against the courts, but as a reflection of ongoing professional and ethical unease. It has shown how complex medical evidence, evolving scientific understanding, and systemic pressures can collide with the justice system that must ultimately reach final decisions. The justice system values certainty. Medicine, by contrast, is built on uncertainty, on probability, differential diagnosis, and revision as knowledge advances. When those two worlds meet, especially in cases involving life, death, and irreversible punishment, the margin for error matters profoundly. Those who argue that this case may represent a miscarriage of justice are not united by certainty of innocence, but by concern that doubt was not fully accommodated. They question whether rare but known neonatal complications were mistaken for deliberate harm, whether systemic failures were reframed as individual guilt, and whether medical ambiguity was forced into a narrative of intent. Those who defend the verdict emphasize the integrity of the trial process, the scrutiny applied to the evidence, and the need for finality. They warn that endlessly reopening convictions risks undermining public confidence in justice itself. Both positions carry weight, and that is what makes this case so difficult. Acknowledging doubt does not mean denying tragedy. Questioning evidence does not mean erasing accountability. And expressing concern about potential error does not mean abandoning the rule of law. It means recognizing that in cases this complex, humility matters, for institutions, for experts, and for all of us watching from the outside. If nothing else, this case forces a broader reflection on how medical evidence is used in criminal courts, on how systems respond under pressure, and on how justice should operate when certainty is claimed in environments where certainty is rarely absolute. This episode does not offer answers. It offers context, perspective, and questions that continue to demand careful consideration. And it ends where it should, with compassion for the families, respect for the seriousness of the law, and an understanding that truth, in cases like this, is rarely simple. If you've watched this episode to the end, thank you for taking the time to engage with a case that is as complex as it is emotionally difficult. Cases like this demand patience, empathy, and a willingness to sit with uncertainty rather than rush to easy conclusions. If you believe these conversations matter, please consider liking the episode, sharing your thoughts in the comments, and subscribing to the Silent Casebook. Your engagement helps keep these discussions thoughtful, visible, and grounded in evidence rather than noise. Most importantly, if you do comment, we ask that you do so with respect. Respect for the families at the center of this case, for differing perspectives, and for the seriousness of what is being discussed.